It all began when I was 18. Now, at 22, the memories still linger vividly in my mind. I lived in San Antonio, Texas, during my senior year of high school, a time that should have been filled with celebrations and goodbyes. But then COVID-19 swept in, turning everything upside down. Schools closed, businesses shut their doors, and life as we knew it came to a screeching halt. While the world was hunkering down in quarantine, my friends and I felt an overwhelming urge to break free from the confinement. With nowhere to go and nothing to do, we found ourselves drawn to the thrill of adventure, seeking out the abandoned and the eerie. Urban exploration became our escape, and haunted places called to us like sirens in the night. Even now, I can't resist the allure of the unknown, the ghostly whispers of the past waiting to be uncovered. I've never been one to scare easily. I've encountered my fair share of unsettling situations, brushes with homeless cults, even having a gun pointed at me. But nothing could prepare me for the eerie experience that lay ahead. As the world outside continued to crumble under the weight of the pandemic, I found myself talking to a girl from my high school class, Clarissa. We were still in the early stages of dating, but I somehow managed to convince her to join me on one of my urban explorations. That night, as we ventured into the unknown, I knew I needed someone to back up my story. If it weren't for her being there, I doubted my friends would ever believe the bizarre things we would encounter. Clarissa was adventurous, and together we formed a bond over our shared curiosity for the strange and supernatural. Little did we know, this night would be unlike any other, a night that would leave an indelible mark on both our lives. It was around 3 a.m. when Clarissa and I pulled into the parking lot of Opschnabel Park, a wooded area that had a reputation for being both beautiful and dangerous. By day, the park was a picturesque retreat, alive with nature and families enjoying the sun. But at night, it transformed into something far more sinister. The police often patrolled the entrances, warding off anyone brave or foolish enough to venture into the darkness. The park carried a haunting history. In 2016, a 24-year-old woman named Lauren Bump had been brutally murdered there, stabbed over 20 times. And just a few years later, in 2021, a boy exploring the woods was shot. With these chilling stories echoing in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as we stepped out of the car. As we ventured deeper into the park, the moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. The trees loomed around us, their twisted branches casting eerie shadows that danced in the dark. It was pitch black, and every sound seemed amplified. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and our own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. It was a moment suspended in time, a mix of excitement and fear bubbling beneath the surface. Little did we know that what awaited us in the depths of the woods would test our courage in ways we never anticipated. As we walked deeper into the park, I kept my flashlight off. I preferred to let my eyes adjust to the darkness, allowing the faint glow of the moonlight to guide our way. There's a certain thrill in exploring the unknown without a beam of light giving away our presence to anyone or anything lurking in the shadows. I didn't want to risk someone seeing my light from afar, drawing unwanted attention to us. After about 15 to 20 minutes of walking along the main trail, the unsettling quietness enveloped us. It felt almost unnatural, as if the woods held their breath in anticipation. I hadn't intended to stay long. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie tension that sent shivers down my spine. I knew of a lesser-known trail that veered off the main road, one that led back toward where my truck was parked. It promised a quicker exit and a chance to escape the oppressive silence. With Clarissa by my side, I gestured towards the offshoot trail, eager to navigate back to safety. But as we turned, the air felt heavier, and an inexplicable feeling of being watched crept over me. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the stories I had heard about the park, but deep down I knew something was off. The night had only just begun, and I had no idea how wrong I was about the safety of our choices. I pointed towards the off-road trail, suggesting we take it to make a full circle back to my truck instead of retracing our steps. Clarissa agreed, and we plunged into the shadows of the path. We had barely been walking for 2 minutes when, out of nowhere, a haunting melody filled the air. A flute began to play. We froze, exchanging glances filled with confusion and unease. The music was eerily melodic, perfectly in cadence, as if it was performing some hauntingly beautiful piece. Yet in that moment the beauty was overshadowed by a creeping dread. The park was supposed to be deserted, and there was no sign of anyone else around. Where was the music coming from? Clarissa looked at me, her eyes wide with concern. I could feel my heart racing as we strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It felt as though the melody wrapped around us, drawing us deeper into the woods, beckoning us forward. There was no time to think about the danger. Curiosity was pulling at me, urging us to investigate further. But a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach warned me that whatever was playing the flute was not an ordinary person. To process what I was hearing was difficult. While the flute had a hauntingly beautiful quality, it was undeniably creepy as hell. As I mentioned before, I wasn't one to scare easily, but after about 15 seconds of that eerie solo, I noticed Clarissa starting to tremble, her face pale and stricken with fear. She was on the brink of tears, and that sight sent a wave of unease crashing over me. I stood there, still listening, trying to make sense of it all. But when Clarissa began praying to God to save her and forgive her for her sins, the gravity of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a clear signal that we were in deeper trouble than I had initially realized. The sound of the flute seemed to float through the air, impossibly difficult to locate. It felt like it was coming from the direction of the deeper woods, where the trees grew denser, their twisted branches forming a shroud around whatever was lurking beyond. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to escape this nightmare before it could fully unfold, but I was rooted to the spot, torn between the fear of moving and the haunting melody that beckoned us closer. The flute's melody seemed to come from somewhere along the previous main trail, which ran parallel to where we stood, with only about 30 to 50 yards of dense woods separating us. But it was getting louder, creeping closer, until it felt like the sound was right on top of us. Clarissa, overwhelmed by fear, could hardly focus, her wide eyes reflecting sheer panic. In that moment, I realized I needed to man up and get us out of this eerie situation. It might sound corny, but I turned to her and said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to let anything happen to you." I knew I had to be brave for both of us. "We need to run down this off-road trail and get away from here," I urged. Without waiting for a response, I took her hand and we bolted down the narrow path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The darkness closed in around us, the trees towering overhead like watchful sentinels. As we ran, the flute music faded, but the chilling feeling of being pursued lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, drowning out any other sound as we sprinted deeper into the shadows. Every instinct screamed for us to escape, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had conjured that haunting melody. But as we dashed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we began to sprint, I thought I heard the flute stop playing, but it was hard to tell amidst the pounding of my heart and the rush of adrenaline. My sole focus was on getting the hell out of that creepy place. We had only made it about 30 feet when, without warning, we heard the rustling of bushes and the snapping of leaves and twigs. In an instant, something large dashed across the trail right in front of us. It could have been a deer or some other wildlife, but something about it felt off. The air seemed to thicken around us, and I could almost feel the size of whatever had crossed our path. I don't know if it was just the wind or pure instinct, but the sensation was chilling. My mind raced, considering all the stories I had heard about what could be lurking in the woods at night. Whatever it was, it moved with a speed and stealth that sent a jolt of fear coursing through me. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Clarissa, my voice trembling slightly. She nodded, eyes wide with terror. We exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. We were both terrified, but the unspoken question loomed. What had just dashed across our path? I felt a surge of urgency. We had to keep moving. With no time to waste, I pulled her along, pushing ourselves faster down the trail, every instinct screaming at us to escape whatever darkness was closing in around us. The feeling of being watched intensified, and as the shadows seemed to shift and swirl, I couldn't shake the fear that we had stirred something we couldn't comprehend. The strange thing was, I never caught a glimpse of a silhouette or any shape in front of us. It felt like the creature had materialized out of thin air, as I hadn't heard it coming, nor did I hear it retreat. The only sound I registered was the sudden dash right in front of us, like a fleeting shadow that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Once we processed what had just happened, instinct kicked in and we turned around, bolting in the opposite direction, desperate to put distance between us and whatever had rushed past. We raced back to the original spot where we had first heard the flute, a place that now felt charged with an unsettling energy. And then, as if the very air was charged with anticipation, the flute began to play again. It was as if the musician had been waiting for our return, ready to lure us back into the depths of the woods. The haunting melody floated through the night, beckoning us, wrapping around us like a cold mist. Clarissa clutched my arm, her breath quickening as she looked at me, a mixture of fear and confusion on her face. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the haunting notes. I didn't have an answer. The music seemed to call out to us, tempting us to come closer, to unravel the mystery of its origin. But the danger felt palpable, and every instinct screamed that we were playing with forces beyond our understanding. The night was thick with tension, and the forest around us felt alive, as if it were waiting to see what we would do next. The flute started to play again, louder and seemingly right on top of us. This time, the melody had an almost chiming quality, reminiscent of an Irish jig, yet it retained that eerie cadence that sent chills down my spine. The music surrounded us, wrapping around the trees and filling the air, but still, we couldn't pinpoint its source. It was as if the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, surging through me like electricity. We were trapped, faced with two terrifying options. Retreat back into the off-road trail where we had heard that ominous dash in front of us, or return to the main trail where the melody had first beckoned us. Each choice felt fraught with danger, and the weight of indecision hung heavily between us. Clarissa's grip on my arm tightened as she looked into the shadows, her eyes wide with terror. "I don't want to go back in there," she said, her voice trembling. I could see the panic rising in her, and it mirrored my own. The darkness felt like it was closing in, and I knew we needed to make a choice. "Let's head back to the main trail," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We can figure out what to do from there." As we turned to retrace our steps, the flute music surged, almost as if it were encouraging us to come closer. It was both a lure and a threat, and the forest seemed to shift around us as we moved. The sense of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was waiting for us to make a wrong move. The flute and the unknown psychopath playing it felt much scarier when I thought about the off-road trail. It was darker and surrounded by denser forest, a place where shadows seemed to come alive. At least the main trail was a well-worn cement path, offering a sliver of comfort amid the chaos. I turned to Clarissa, who was still trembling, her face pale with fear. "Let's start running down the main trail back to the truck," I urged. With adrenaline coursing through our veins, we sprinted down the trail, cutting our usual 20-minute walk into a frantic 7 to 8-minute jog. Each step felt like a desperate bid for safety, the sound of our feet pounding against the pavement, echoing in the stillness of the night. Somewhere along the way, the haunting flute noise faded into the distance, but the air remained thick with tension. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The night was eerily silent except for our heavy breathing and the rustling of leaves, but then, out of nowhere, we stumbled upon a random clearing that opened up on our left. The moonlight illuminated it just enough for me to see, and it felt strangely out of place amidst the oppressive darkness of the woods. In the center of the clearing, there stood an old, abandoned gazebo, its structure rotting and overtaken by vines. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, a forgotten relic that could hold countless secrets. I briefly considered whether we should stop and check it out, but the instinct to flee was overpowering. "Should we look?" I asked, glancing at Clarissa, who shook her head vehemently, her eyes wide with fear. "No, we need to keep going," she insisted, pulling me back towards the main trail. As we reached the main trail, I spotted a porta-potty set up near the entrance. My heart sank, and I was scared to death at the thought of what could be on the other side, or, worse yet, hiding inside. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. Imagine the sudden realization that someone could be waiting just out of sight, ready to ambush us. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Thankfully, I didn't see anyone or any signs of life. In fact, my truck was the only vehicle parked in the area near the main entrance to the woods. Relief washed over me as we finally made it to the truck. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away from that haunted place as fast as I could. The night felt like a nightmare I was desperate to escape, and I drove in silence, my thoughts racing with adrenaline and fear. The next day, still shaken, I gathered my friends and recounted the bizarre events of the previous night. Their faces were a mix of disbelief and excitement, and I could see their imaginations running wild as I described the flute music, the mysterious dash across the trail, and the abandoned gazebo. Determined to find answers, I scoured the internet, hoping to discover if anyone else had experienced something similar. What I found was disturbing. There were threads filled with stories of eerie encounters in the very same park, whispers of sightings, strange noises at night, and tales of people vanishing without a trace. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we were not the first to feel the haunting presence of whatever lurked in those woods. It was as if we had stumbled upon a dark secret, one that many had encountered but few dared to discuss openly. The questions loomed in my mind. What had we experienced that night? And more importantly, would we ever be brave enough to return? Despite my extensive searches, I couldn't find anything about a haunting flute solo or even similar stories about ghostly encounters in the woods. Sure, there were plenty of claims about run-ins with ghostly cults or animals making terrifying noises, but nothing about that soft and rhythmic flute melody that had haunted us. Maybe I just didn't look hard enough, but it felt like we had stumbled into an unspeakable secret that no one else had encountered. There were houses on the far edge of the woods that eventually led into a neighborhood, but those homes were at least a couple of miles away from where we had been. We were deep within the forest, surrounded by thick trees and darkness, so there was no way the sound could have traveled that far. The flute was clear as day, slicing through the silence of the night, and I knew without a doubt it was 3 a.m. when we first heard it. I sat there in disbelief, replaying the events in my mind. The melody had been so hauntingly beautiful yet so deeply unsettling. It didn't make sense. Where had it come from? Who had played it? The questions spiraled in my head, each one feeding into the growing mystery of that night. My thoughts drifted to Clarissa and how shaken she had been. We had both felt the weight of something sinister, something lurking just beyond the shadows. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I began to reach out to local forums, hoping to connect with anyone who might know more about the park and its dark history. I wanted to uncover the truth behind the flute and whatever presence might be hiding in those woods. But with every passing hour, the haunting melody echoed in my mind, a reminder that some mysteries might be better left unsolved. Obviously, I never found out who was playing that flute or what had dashed right in front of us that night. Even as I sit here writing this, I feel chills running down my spine. The more I think about it, the more it seems to drift into the realm of the paranormal rather than something tangible and explainable. Was it a person? A ghost? A cult? The questions linger in the back of my mind, and I can't help but hope that someone out there might have a rational explanation for what we experienced. In the end, I never went back to those woods at night. The memory of that eerie flute and the shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight held too much weight for me to face again. I still explore plenty of creepy places, drawn to the thrill of the unknown, but I've never come across anything quite like that again. Each abandoned building and dark alley holds its own stories, but none have left me feeling so deeply unsettled. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, whispered about in the dark but never fully understood. Whatever it was that night, whether a haunting melody or a glimpse of something otherworldly, it remains a chilling reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. And every time I venture out into the night, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to hear that soft, rhythmic flute echoing through the trees once more.